The next item of business is a presentation from former Administrative Law Judge Eric Lippman to tell us about his experience with rate cases. Judge Lippman, please introduce yourself to the committee and proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman, members. My name is Eric Lippman, and until December of last year, I was an administrative law judge with the Court of Administrative Hearings. I served on that court for 19 years, doing the kind of rate cases that set natural gas and electricity rates for your constituents. There are four key takeaways for members from my presentation, but before I get into the slides, I just wanted to take a moment to describe a little bit more about my background and how I came to learn the things that I want to share with you today. In state government, I'm what they call a 30-year man. Okay? Across a number of different assignments, I worked for 3 decades for the state of Minnesota. I cared deeply about this state and really dedicated my professional life to try and improve the way that it functions and it operates. I'm really proud to be a Minnesotan. And it occurred to me that before I began today, in fact, maybe it's because I can't hold down a job, I've literally done almost every assignment in this room. Legislative assistant, researcher, agency staff, gubernatorial staff, member, vice chairman. And so across all of those different assignments, I'm someone who, like I said, dedicated my professional life to try and make things better than the way I found it. And that's why I'm here today, okay? All of that is a long way of saying I'm just like you. I care about our state institutions more than most things. That background, I think, is important because the things that I'm going to talk about today, the things I'm going to describe, the arguments that I'm going to make, they're going to hurt some feelings. Some people are going to feel unduly attacked or criticized because I have some concerns about how state government is operating and how it's treating the poorest constituents in each of your districts, the poorest ratepayers. That's who I'm concerned about. And again, it was quite uncomfortable in December of this past year, where I literally burned my Hanukkah card list, my Christmas card list down to the studs. I'm not really all that welcome in the public utilities law section anymore. I'm probably a pariah amongst my former colleagues a little bit because of the things that I've been saying about rate regulation in the state of Minnesota. They're quite, they're fairly controversial, I admit that. But I think that they're actually true. And when it came time for choosing, and all of us have time for choosing, when I was thinking about this and whether I would lead state government this past autumn, and I did, I was reminded that members, both House and Senate, when talking about the situation with feeding our future, said, oh boy, we wish that folks in state government who knew about problems with how our state government is operating would have had the courage to come forward and to say the uncomfortable things out loud, even if it was an implied criticism or an overt criticism of how their work colleagues were operating. There are some things that are more important, and I entirely agree. So, again, notwithstanding the fact that I have fewer friends today than I did last autumn, I feel better about passing myself in the mirror in the morning when I have to shave, because I really care about the poorest ratepayers. And when I was an administrative law judge, we would hear from folks in public hearings, I can't afford the 6% increase. I can't afford the rate increase of 8% or 10% or whatever it's going to be. I think government and how it is operating is, in fact, reducing access to services and pricing people in ways that make access to electricity and some of the horrible choices. I have to choose between medicine or groceries and the electricity bill that I'm facing. That's horrible. That's not something that state government should contribute to, and I think it does. At least that's the argument I'm going to try to make to you today. So, there are 4 key takeaways, as I suggested. There's been a sharp rise in the amount of government expenses that are charged by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission to your ratepayers. The MPUC's assessments to ratepayers, in my view, is the most regressive tax we have here in Minnesota. It has your poorest constituent ratepayers in the draftiest houses paying more of the government expenses than folks like me who live in an energy-efficient home. Why? Because the government expenses are put on a per-therm basis for natural gas and a kilowatt basis to electricity rates. So if you have an energy inefficient home, and we all know that energy efficiency is correlated to rises in income, folks who are richer tend to live in more energy efficient homes, that this operates as a regressive tax on the poor. And it became intolerable to me. I didn't want to be a part of this system or have to pretend when I was on the bench listening to folks struggling to pay these bills that I really didn't care, or that I didn't do all that I could to try and remediate that situation. How that works is there's a 2/5 formula that is assigned, and again, no fault of the PUC, it's in statute, 216B.62, that gives the PUC the ability to charge more in agency expenses, 4 cents more, for every $10 it awards to the utilities that come before it and ask for a rate increase. So, for example, Xcel Energy is now petitioning for a $63 million increase in revenue for natural gas services. If that happens, I'm not saying it will, but if that happens, that would be like dropping off a suitcase full of $250,000 to the MPUC. They swear up and down they don't in fact want the situation. They don't want that suitcase full of $250,000, but it arrives because of the operation of the statute, whether they like it or not. And I think, as I'll argue in the handout on the cases, I've cited 4 cases, 3 Supreme Court cases and 1 Circuit Court case that suggests that there are significant due process concerns if you have an agency that is making decisions that in fact has a financial interest or a financial benefit from the decisions it makes. I think it makes for an intolerable situation not only for the commission, but for my former court. They're not business partners. They're supposed to be neutrals. They're supposed to be detached. And the statute, with regret, again, I don't think it's intentional, but with regret makes them co-venturers. And I think the other piece that is regrettable for the poorest ratepayers in your district is that unlike the State Board of Investment, the MPUC uses lawyers and litigation in order to make key policy choices. The State Board of Investment uses market-based metrics. And as someone who was a former deputy to Secretary Kiffmeyer and served on SBI State Board of Investment committees, the work that the SBI does with $160 billion worth of pension portfolios is just as complicated as the $7.6 billion of rate regulation that the Public Utilities Commission. It's not an order of magnitude difficult. They're very similar, as I'll I think, make clear. So let's get into it and how it happens, because I do want to be respectful of time. So here are the budget pages. I'm a former appropriator and member of finance committees, was conferee on omnibus bills. These are the most remarkable budget pages I've ever seen because they don't have parentheses. They arrive at committee, and for the new members of the committee, I particularly wanted to make a special mention. Here the PUC comes in, and it's like, great, you're not asking for general fund money. Or if you're asking for general fund money, it's an appropriation with air quotes, but they're going to pay, as they say in the background information, they're going to pay all of that money back. So the fiscal note is great. If you're an agency, we're not really causing you anything. You're not in the scrum of the other agencies trying to fight for your piece of the targets. You've got your own funding mechanism, which is entirely separate. The problem with that they don't tell you is that it goes on a per-therm basis to the poorest constituent in the most regressive tax. I think it's in fact harmful. I was fiscal conservative when I was a member. I would not want a situation of funding the PUC in this way because it's so harmful to regular ratepayers. And it's a 60% increase. That has allowed them in the last 2 years to add 27 additional employees. It's real dollars and a real impact. I think it's also optically bad for the commission because, as I've excerpted right here, this is a page from the notice and order for hearing in that natural gas case I talked about. For cost of gas, cost of distribution, customer service, administrative and general expense, if Xcel had a 60% increase, the PUC would send them to a trial. There's going to be 10 months of litigation over the propriety of these expenses. So I think that by the PUC's own standards, this committee should take an active role in exploring how these dollars are spent and whether they should be assessed to the very poorest in your district. So here's 216B62. I'll just highlight the statute briefly. You can see in that second red box the 2/5 of 1%. That's a very small number, 2/5 of 1%, 0.004. But it's multiplied against a very large number, which is the gross operating income of your 9 rate-regulated utilities. Again, we're not at a position where the PUC is charging $30 million worth of expenses in order to decide, among other things, what rates are charged, but that's where we're headed, and that's what the statute right now, as of today, would permit. I think it's an intolerable situation. I think these kinds of expenses to the poorest are also intolerable, and I'd encourage folks to think about it. What would the PUC say about this? Well, Secretary Bull told you last week, hey, we've taken $1 billion out of the system because of the way that we do things, and our rates, at least our electricity rates, are in the bottom decile of all 50 states. We're in the lowest 5, which is where we want to be. I think those arguments, in fact, raise more questions than they do, in fact, answer. The $1 billion number is a comparison with what the utility filed in its application. Hi, PUC, we'd like this extra amount in money, with what actually happens at the end of 10 months of litigation, what the PUC actually awards. I think that's a phony baloney number. I call it the MSRP problem. If you're going into an auto dealership and you want to buy a new automobile, the manufacturer's suggested retail price is X. Let's say it's, I don't know, a new Ford truck, $30,000. No consumer, very few, pay the MSRP price. And it allows the dealership to say, oh, no, I'm giving you much less than the dealership price, or at least the MSRP price, because the dealership price is lower, and I'm passing the savings on to you. I think that that's the problem in the comparison. Only the most naive and guileless consumer would say, oh, no, I saved off of the MSRP, I saved a boatload of money. No, it's a phony baloney figure. That was never going to be the price of the car in the first place. I think that's the same thing here. Their initial bid for Excel, by way of an example, in its application, they know that they're not going to end up at that number. They know that they're going to have 10 months of really expensive litigation fighting about that number. It's, I think, artificially high. I wouldn't compare the, quote, savings that you make over that. And it also assumes that there isn't any other way other than 10 months of grinding litigation in order to get that lower number. If you know that you want to be in the bottom decile of electricity rates, for example, as Secretary Bull said last week, great. Why not make that the standard? Why do we need a trial? You know where you wanted to end up as far as the price point, and that's what matters. There are also, as I said, significant due process concerns. I think it undermines the validity and the legitimacy of the process. Again, you can look at the 4 cases I've decided. Here are cases of tribunals and administrative boards that had an active financial interest, benefited from the decisions that they make. It's improper. We've got to change the system because, again, no fault of their own, but it is corrupting, and I think it's inappropriate. So, are you paying for 1 dozen lawyers or 2 today? That's the question that we've had over the last 9 rate cases. Between 13 at the bottom and 24 at the top, we are over-lawyered. In the Excel rate case that I talked about, 8 lawyers on behalf of Excel across 3 law firms in order to answer the questions of what is just and reasonable rates. I think that's too many, particularly because most of these lawyers that I've charted here are charging your constituents these enormous bills. And I would suggest to you that the downtown law firms that Xcel Energy has hired, not all that affordable. We're not talking about the public defender service here involved in a rate-making case. We're talking about the most talented, most expensive lawyers in the state billing simultaneously. So you have 18 or 20 or 24 hourly rates going at the same time, all on to your poorest constituents. I think it's a scandal. I think it's inappropriate. Is there an alternative? I think there is. It occurs to me that as a state pensioner and also an Xcel customer for natural gas and electricity service, I'm in fact served by 2 different state agencies. From the State Board of Investment, I get great service. They allow me to pay those higher electricity and natural gas bills because of the way that they managed my state contributions and they manage my pension. $160 billion worth of a portfolio they're wonderful people. And in fact, they have a very similar budget and very similar staff complement to the PUC. And yet they're 20 times the regulatory reach. They're able to do 20 times the kind of regulation and regulatory oversight that the PUC. Why? Because they don't use lawyers. They get knowledgeable volunteers in the investment advisory committee. They use market metrics. What's the beta risk? What's the alpha risk of this particular investment? What are you against your proxy group? How do you do against the S&P? These are all available for either a Wall Street Journal subscription or, tuning into MSNBC. You can see these kinds of metrics. They're widely available to people, and they're really affordable. They don't require hourly rates of teams of lawyers. That's not how we do financial oversight with the PUC, and the expenses are being borne by each and every one of us. I think we need to change the system, and we can. What I'm talking about is not science fiction. Obviously, it's not very far from Empire Drive to East 7th Street. Those folks can, in fact, talk to each other. And also, I think it's important to say that for 10 years, we will celebrate the 10th year that the Minnesota legislature 10 years ago, and we'll celebrate in June when that bill became effective, have performance-based rate making. Now, in April of this year, the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission is going to decide whether it even continues thinking about doing this in any other way. In fact, there's a significant suggestion that they're going to have the utilities stop doing performance-based reporting about how we could do this in another way and abandon the enterprise, notwithstanding that very helpful statute. The MPUC is going to give up. It seems to like its lawyers and is not really looking for a situation out of this situation. I think that they need some nudging and oversight and some hard questions from the members of this committee and the members of the legislature, because it has a real-world impact. If I could use the example of the vice chairman's district, Deputy Commissioner Wyckoff said last week that access to natural gas is correlated to energy burden. If you're more likely to have access to natural gas service, you're less likely to be energy burdened. On this chart, the vice chairman's district is among the bluest in the state, the most energy burdened. And if you want to explore why that is the case, I'll give you my theory and also a test that I hope that members will undertake. It's called the 2-beer test. And if you don't drink beer, that's fine. The beers are not for you. I'm asking each member in their own time to find a member who works for, or a member of the public who works for a rate-regulated utility that's regulated at the municipal level, less than 5,000 customers in natural gas. And there are such companies that are operating around the state. And after the 2 beers, maybe when they're singing to the jukebox music, maybe they're enjoying themselves to feel a little bit more comfortable, you ask them the key question. Are you guys looking forward to expanding your business beyond 5,000 customers? It's my prediction that they will say no and hell no. And you have to ask them, why? Well, because now we're going to be subject to the crazy town that is a regulation downtown with the PUC. It means all sorts of lawyers and regulatory expenses that we just don't want to bear. And it's really hard for a small company to do just that. So if local natural gas companies are not growing, as I am suggesting to you that they aren't, that means more energy burden. There are places that could be receiving natural gas service. We draw them off of more expensive propane and home heating oil, and in some cases, God forbid, wood, as far as a home heating solution, and give them a PHMSA-regulated natural gas pipeline that's a third of the price that they're paying, for home heating oil or for propane. I think it's a moral issue. It was one so troubling to me, again, that I was inspired to quit. If I'm right about that, we can do a lot about energy burden by expanding access to natural gas service, but we first have to do regulatory reform because those folks don't, in fact, want to grow their business beyond 5,000 customers. Super problematic. and I think harmful. And it's something, again, I hate saying it out loud, but it really does need to be said, because there are people in your districts that are suffering with these bills, and I think, at least in part, we, as state agency officials or Minnesotans, are part of that problem. And so with that, I'm grateful for the members' time, and I'm delighted to answer any questions and to yield to the mic to the other business.